Hi, all. I am Brando Farr, Topanga Canyon native, amateur mycologist, mushroom hunter, chef extraordinaire.
Welcome to Enlightened Omnivore, the monthly podcast that serves up a delicious mix of food, sustainability, and travel. I'm your host, Steve Sabaker, here to explore the wonders of mindful eating. Join me each month as I dig into the stories behind our food system, discover new ways to live sustainably, and embark on culinary adventures around the globe or right in your very own kitchen. Get ready to expand your palate and your mind, one bite at a time. This is Enlightened Omnivore, everything in moderation. Excited to have Brando Farr here, and I know that we're going to have a curious and compelling conversation for the next hour about mushrooms.
Hi, all. I am Brando Farr, Topanga Canyon native and amateur mycologist, mushroom hunter, chef extraordinaire.
And that was my question for you too, is do you want to be a mushroom hunter? Is that the term?
Yeah, I kind of bounce back and forth like most Geminis will. So I have mushroom hunter friends that love being referred to as mushroom hunters and others who don't want to be known as that. Other guys who don't really like the word forage. I have often described myself as a mushroom whisperer, but there's like a bit of cheekiness and playfulness attached to that for sure. I don't often think of myself as a chef or a mushroom hunter, but those are titles that people can grasp onto for lack of always a clear, concise way to describe the alternative preferences. So yes, I don't mind being referred to as a chef. I don't mind being referred to as a mushroom hunter because I am those things, but I am more. So that's the long answer right there.
Tell me how you got started mushroom hunting.
Well, first and foremost, I got to say here that you picked some wonderful topics and questions to ask, some of the best that I feel like I've ever been asked on any podcast. So yeah, and that fuels me and gives me energy and insight and kind of just gets the thought process going.
Well, now you're
There,
just buttering up the host here, Brando.
no, man, I'm just being real. I'm being
Well,
straight
thank
up.
you.
Yeah,
Thank you so
man.
much. I appreciate that. No, and I'm
Yeah.
fascinated by what you're doing. And I wanted to let my listeners know that, I mean, Brando and I have just met. We met last week, actually, at the LA Mycological Society's annual mushroom fair, which was at the LA Arboretum, which if you ever get a chance to go, it's a fantastic show. It's just a great way to meet a community of like-minded folks, a bunch of us mushroom weirdos. And I had a blast. I took my son and he was less enthused, but it worked out. We
Of
got there.
course.
Yeah. But we sat in on Brando's cooking class, which I've seen a lot of food demos in my day. And I thought you did a great job. And you shared a bunch of information that I think is really relevant for my listeners. So looking forward to our conversation today. But yeah, we're talking about mushrooms.
Excellent, man. Okay, so mushrooms. Well, how did I get started with mushrooms? My father was the first person to bring me into the world of mushrooms. I grew up in Topanga Canyon, which for anybody who's not heard of this place or not been here, it's extremely rural. It's got a lot of parkland, a lot of beautiful canyons, little valleys and creeks and springs, lots of nature, lots of habitat or, scientifically known ecology. So I grew up in this as my backyard. I had toys, little plastic toys and wood toys and things, but nature made up probably 75% of my, imagination time, playtime. And, I spent a lot of time outdoors playing with things, playing with the mud, playing with the sticks and the plants and the creatures. And my father, who was, very artistic, sort of came out of the British folk rock and blues scene, traveled all over the world. And his name was Gary Farr. He was also a photographer and a chef and a fine furniture and carpentry builder and maker.
A
So he
true
was
a true
very
Renaissance
gifted,
man.
totally absolute Renaissance man. And he also had a love for cooking and for mushrooms. So some of my earliest memories were of him taking me outside, opening up his book, which was at that time, God, this must have been probably late 80s, early, like 87, 88, 89, 1990. I was born in 84. And he had the Audubon Society book, which was my first exposure to mushrooms in a book, photographs of mushrooms. And, now, of course, the book it's extremely novelty and kind of outdated as far as the nomenclature goes, the naming of mushrooms based on now we have more and more revelation of DNA analysis depicting that mushrooms are in fact diverse and they're being separated by species name because they're showing up to be separate and different species, not just umbrellaed under one name. That Audubon Society book is at that time, that was the book, sort of one of the books. And that was my first exposure to mushrooms, is my father opening this book, and he had his Brit accent, and he was a writer and a singer and a storyteller. He had this presence, and he would open this book and show me these pages, and he would say, "Oh, son, look at this here. This is the death cap, or this is the destroying angel. And you never touch these. And this is Amanita. And talk to me about it. You never touch them. And make sure you always come to me and you talk to me if you find these mushrooms." And so that was some of the earliest memories, was him showing me these photographs in this book, but also these memories of him. And they're very clear still, of him taking me out into parkland and explaining to me how the best time to mushroom hunt was after the first few rainstorms, when the mushrooms are still growing under the thick beds of oak leaves, because they haven't revealed and announced themselves yet. So often people can't see them unless they're, clued in and they know what to look for with those little mounds of leaves. I later came to know of them as shrumps, mushroom bumps hiding under the leaves or the pine needles.
And you're talking about Topanga. I want to make sure my listeners know. I mean, for the folks in LA, we've all heard of Topanga, and there's a rich history of people escaping to this lush little community that's tucked up in the mountainside of the Santa Monica Mountains, and the artistic and musical community that continues to live up in Topanga. But can you describe? I mean, Topanga's only what, 15 miles from downtown?
Yeah, if
Like,
that. It
yeah.
might be a little more, actually. I should know my own city. You'd never know it though, unless you grew up here, because it looks like a pocket straight out of somewhere in Sonoma County.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. That's how I describe it too. So, and perfect as you were talking, perfect for mushrooms. What is it about the local ecosystem and the seasonality of the mushroom cycle that makes Topanga so special around here?
Well, in context of special, like with Southern California, I would say really anywhere where there is, coast live oak or live oak ecosystem with creeks. So riparian being close to where creeks are, riparian habitat, canyons, mountains, within a specific proximity of the ocean. And I think that that's really what sets places like Topanga, sets it apart from, other portions, other mountains in Southern California and Los Angeles County. But we do get a little bit cooler, a little bit wetter weather here, maybe more mild, sometimes depending on where you're at. We get these microclimates that, can hold on to cooler temps or extra moisture. Mushrooms like moist pockets. They like zones that can nurture what it is that they need, and that is precipitation and rainfall and damp soil. But it's also fruiting temperatures a lot of the times. If it's just, too hot, too dry, or if it's too cold, uh, potentially with frost. And when there is colder temperature like that, it tends to sort of slow down the proliferation and fruiting cycles of mushrooms. And a lot of the mushrooms that we like to find and pick and eat are no different. And they really require not just proper saturation and precipitation of soil, but also fruiting temperatures. And we're talking, mid 60s, mid 70s.
When you're talking fruiting, this is an important topic too, I think, because I didn't know this until maybe a year ago. When you're looking at a mushroom, most of the plant or the fungus is actually not is hidden, right? It's below the surface or doesn't look like the mushrooms that we would draw, as in a cartoon. That's that mycelium, right? I don't know. I've had it described to me as the trunk of the tree or the tree, and then the fruit that you're talking about when they go to fruit is that's the mushroom that we think of, like the one with the shape with the cap and the stem. How would you describe the difference between mycelium and fruiting bodies?
Most folks who've come to know more and more about mushrooms through pop culture, or maybe who were into it before the popular documentaries and, all the stuff on social media and the books. The mycelium is the large organism that's underground that we can't generally see, but that we know of, that we know exists, that it's connected to everything. They know enough about what things look like underground to know that it looks like this vast silky threaded webbing, this network of webbing that expands and connects and goes from forest to forest or tree to tree or shrub to shrub, connecting plants and trees and decomposing plant debris and wood matter. Because there are, different ways in which mushrooms connect to things and how they sort of perform their roles in nature and ecology. And some roles are to break down wood mass and decompose and eat them, and continue to build soil. So mushrooms are a vital part of this ecosystem, this planet. And then in other ways, they connect to trees and they pull nutrients and water to the roots of trees. And those are mycorrhizal genuses and species that obviously, help to keep trees and plants healthy by um, pulling and nutrients, pooling up their nutrient stores and then feeding the trees. And in return, the trees are, they're feeding the mycelium. So there's a mutually beneficial relationship happening with trees through osmosis when the trees are healthy and deeply nourished through um, photosynthesis, rather. The trees are making, food through the sun, through their leaves, and then they're sending down sugars or starches or carbs or whatever to the mycelium. So when the mycelium and the trees are both healthy, and they're both thriving and able to share their stores so freely with each other, you'll get mycelium that is able to really thrive and mature. So maturing mycelial threads will connect and then breed, give off little babies, little pins, hyphae. And then those hyphae will, grow. And before we know it, we see these tiny little budding fruits or flowers, rather. Some people prefer to say fruits. Some people prefer to say flowers. And everybody's got a different opinion, be it like uber scientific or more theoretical. But that's how I have come to understand it is, the larger organism is the mycelium. And that's the real part of the thriving living organisms, all underground or in a tree. And then the fruiting bodies are the reproductive parts of the mycelium that pop up. And they represent these little beacons of life that then spore out and send spore dust, which grows more mycelium, travels in the wind, it travels with rain. Animals eat them, people pick them. It stimulates more release of spore dust, thus resulting in the potential for more and more mycelial networks to be started in different places.
So, when you are hunting for mushrooms, what are you looking for? What are the telltale signs of a good hunting ground?
I mean, man, there's a lot of moving parts to that. Through living in Topanga, the osmosis of living in Topanga and having maybe a deeper look at nature and landscapes, and then being fortunate enough in timing, it has just shaped me as somebody who's been curious and who's developed the eye to see things that a lot of my friends and family don't see. And I've been referred to as eagle eyes or, spidey sense mushroom guy or Mr. Psychic with X-ray vision. And some of them are more woo woo, some of them are more scientific. And I can truly just say that I have good eyesight, unless I haven't been using my eyes for anything more than staring at a screen. So in the off season, I do too much screen staring and not enough landscape gazing. And then I have to readjust my eyes. But in Topanga, growing up here and traveling all over Northern California, I have used that eyesight and continued to fine tune it and learn about how mushrooms grow, where they grow, what their characteristics or tendencies tend to be. Obviously, books have shaped some of that, learning and studying the theoretical knowledge and research that's been laid down in books. I can recommend several. Reading on Facebook, the identification forums, the mushroom hunter forums. I have built and garnered friendships and connections through those forums. I use them less these days because I'm trying to use social media less. But really, to sum it all up, I would say that just being immersed in nature has shaped how I see things.
And what
Uh,
are you seeing when you're looking with these eagle eyes? It sounds like you've got kind of a sixth sense. Maybe you're seeing things that we can't, but are there things that you've over the years have come to identify as, you mentioned these shrumps,
mhm.
the
Yeah,
the shroom bumps. So this is kind of the fruiting bodies, the mushrooms pushing up the layers of leaves on the ground. So you kind of see that they're kind of popping up a little bit. Is that one of the
absolutely.
telltales?
Absolutely is. And yeah, I mean, like I said, reading the landscape, there's a lot of different parts and understanding that through learning over years, I'm looking for all kinds of things. There's a lot of parts to this that have been, built up and accumulated and sort of studied from a vast array of teachers and field guides. But I'm looking for a number of things. I'm looking for, yeah, obviously shrumps, little bumps under the leaves where the mushrooms are forming and they're, swelling. They're pulling moisture to them like sponges because mushrooms are sponges and they're going through their growth cycles until they get big enough to pop up out and reveal themselves and then start spreading their spores, which is what the main primary purpose of mushrooms, the reproductive part of the mycelium. So they're growing and swelling under oak leaves. And from the very beginning, I think didn't start seeing shrumps until the second mushroom season I got started with this. And that was in 2011, 2010 being the first one. But 2011 was when I first started finding shrumps. And, the first couple shrumps I started seeing and discovering that there were mushrooms growing underneath them, the more and more my awareness started to cue in on that and sort of scan landscapes through the forest and feel out, but also seek and search out visually these little, subtle mounds under the leaves. And sometimes there isn't a mushroom underneath that shrub. Sometimes somebody's buried their dog poop and then you've come away with a nice gooey surprise on your fingers. So at least you hope it's dog poop anyways. So
And Topanga Canyon, you never know.
anywhere, you never know. Sometimes it's a pine cone or a rock or somebody's buried something. But I'm also looking for trees, man, because tree identification is a huge part of understanding your habitats and which mushrooms could potentially be in that area. So we're talking oaks, we're talking pines, firs, Doug firs, eucalyptus, Sitka spruce, sycamores. On the East Coast is largely hardwood. So you got, ash and elm and beech and birch and oak. I got started really learning about one mushroom, which was the California golden chanterelle. That's the one that was coveted by my father and his friend, this old French lady, who had a huge part to do with how and why I got interested in finding mushrooms in the first place. But tree identification has been largely a big part of that because obviously you got to understand your habitats. You're looking for something specific, then you got to learn about where to look and understand the relationships to the trees that they have.
And so certain types of mushrooms prefer certain tree species?
Absolutely. And, some mushrooms are very specific where they just want that type of tree to grow with. And they maybe haven't made their evolutionary leap to grow with other trees yet. And then there are other genus that are known as generalists. And they can grow with a whole slew and variety of different types of trees and have maybe really excelled their evolutionary leaps in terms of what trees they are now able to grow with. And one perfect example of that is the Amanita phalloides, which is the death cap. And it's my understanding that that is a genus, the Amanita genus, but the species of that genus that hitchhiked here from somewhere in Europe. And it hitchhiked on the roots of an oak tree, cork oak. And it, over time, adapted and built new relationships with other trees and is now pretty widespread. In fact, you may be able to find that species, death cap, in most places in the world,
Wow.
excluding places that are too cold.
This is the one your dad was telling you not to get anywhere near.
This is the infamous do not touch son mushroom, the death cap. It's one of the earliest ones I remember him telling me about, that and the destroying angel, which is also another type of amanita. And both of them grow in California.
Yeah, destroying angel doesn't sound very edible.
Of course not.
Well, tell us a little bit about that. I know that a lot of people, and myself included as a child, when mushrooms came up in the yard, my parents would be adamant I didn't get anywhere near them. And, they were almost radioactive. They had to be removed with gloves or a plastic bag and thrown in the trash.
Yeah. There's a stigma.
Yeah, there's a stigma and there's some truth to it, right? So what do you do to protect you and your guests when you take them out to hunt? Is that a
Yeah.
concern of yours? How is it hype? What's the tip there?
Yes and no. These days, I don't lead a lot of experiences, if any, where I encourage my students to pick. If we're doing tastings or dinners with wild mushrooms, then that's something I'm doing on my own time. And I have different reasons why that's the case. One of them is liability. Of course, if I come into contact with a safe edible species while I'm guiding a group, I might harvest it. But I also have to ensure that I'm being responsible and ethical with guiding these groups because, I got backlash. I got a certain backlash from folks in my community. And, obviously, like I can't guide groups and lead groups on state park property, even though I have mixed feelings about that. Um, I'm not trying to be uh, a big rule breaker and, create controversy in my small town. I want to be able to have access to these wild places. And I recognize that, yeah, if everybody came to the parks and took what they wanted, well, how do we regulate that? How do we educate people? How do we spread awareness of reciprocity and proper ethics? And then again, it's like, it's tricky because everybody's got their opinion and their interpretation of what's right and wrong and the law. And so to steer things back, how I take care of people is taking their slow time to learn and study reputable field guides and identification manuals. I'm a huge advocate of people joining mycological societies learning how to take varied aspects of photographs of mushrooms for identification purposes, and then learning how to use apps like iNaturalist, how to post photos and details and information about mushrooms they want to get clear identifications for on forums like Facebook Mushroom Identification for California. And to seek out experts and professionals, people that have been studying this for a long time. I, in some ways, consider myself expert. In a lot of other ways, I'm a student, just like a lot of the people that come on my trips. And so there's a responsibility that I have to hold to convey to those people that what is edible, what is safe, and anybody should choose to pick and eat anything when they're out in the wild, then they have to understand that they take responsibility for making that decision, picking something, deciding that it's safe to eat and cook and test out on themselves. It's not something I take lightly. And again, like I I advocate for and I really, really encourage taking your slow time with learning how to identify one, maybe two species at a time. You'll usually learn about more than one mushroom when you're just pursuing studying one mushroom because it will generally have lookalikes, toxic or inedible lookalikes, or just lookalikes that are edible, but they're not that exact mushroom that they're looking for. So through the pursuance of studying one mushroom, one will often come to know others. And so that's a really interesting, natural, organic way of studying mushrooms and learning about mushrooms without just trying to take on the whole book or the whole, wow, look at all the photos we took of all these different species at once. Because sure, you can spend time identifying with your app, but not many people can retain all of that information. So start slow to keep a journal, make notes, take varied photographs, and start with really trying to decipher and learn one species at a time. So
Is
yeah.
there a is there an app or a tool that you really recommend for folks who are starting out? You mentioned iNaturalist, but that doesn't identify them, right? That's just you post where you saw them.
Oh no, iNaturalist definitely gives suggestions
Oh, okay.
as to what species or genus you may have found based on visuals and also based on proximity of certain mushrooms that have been found in that same area. And it's helpful, and I see it being leaned on a lot. And I've I've not always been a huge fan of iNaturalist, probably because I didn't really understand it or know how to use it properly, and I was more fixated and focused on prize edible hunting, which I've largely changed my interest and my curiosity and my perspective on that. And I do use iNaturalist. And I do believe that it's helpful and useful scientifically speaking. It helps us to learn about what is growing in specific areas and maybe make new discoveries and catalog those discoveries. So I believe in the role of citizen scientists that it has been instrumental in helping us to understand more about unexplored habitats and species in those habitats. So iNaturalist is a great resource, but I really can't stress the importance enough on getting yourself a good book, getting a couple good books.
What are some out there that you would recommend?
Well, the very first mushroom book I came into contact with as my very own book as an adult, which was a little field pocket guide by a guy named David Aurora, who did some of the earlier work in the 70s and 80s on mushroom hunting and identification. And he put out a sort of still like a mushroom Bible that is called Mushrooms Demystified. I've never owned a copy of that. The closest I got was owning a copy of All That the Rain Promises and More. And that is the little hip pocket field guide. And even that is a little bit outdated now, but it's the first book I owned, and I just devoured it and digested it over time. It taught me a lot. It's got a lot of fun, weird, quirky stories in it. And so that was my sort of launch pad as an adult with mushrooms. And then a span of years later, once the drought finally ended, I came into contact with a book called Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast. And that was a long term project of these two mycologists, photographer, biologist fellows named um, Christian Schwarz and Noah Siegel. And I have yet to meet both of those fellows, but a lot of friends of mine are friends of theirs or know them. And, they've done a tremendous amount of work and captured some amazing photographs and have really just like life's passion into this book. Amazing photographs. That book came out in, I think, 2017. So I got a copy of that book and it really sent me just into a much deeper exploration of California in general, because it depicts most of California, specifically central going up into the far north coast and even parts of Southern Oregon. So that is a great book, Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast. I learned a tremendous amount from that book. And, again, with the Facebook identification forums, which were also very helpful, and they connected me to many more experts, some of which I'm very fortunate to now call good friends of mine. But that is a great book. So I would recommend books like Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast. They also recently put out a book called Mushrooms of Cascadia, which focuses a bit more on obviously mushrooms of the Pacific Northwest.
So folks should be looking if they want to go out and learn to hunt. Getting a book is a great start. Going into an area that's got water, that's got trees, that's got
The,
some good leaf cover.
the
There-
book is going to really build you visually, theoretically. It's going to help you continue to understand about the diagnostics we call of identification, and with diagnostics being the chief identifying factors and characteristics of genuses and species in those genuses. Because it's like doing detective work. It's like doing a sketch, a profile of somebody. You're connecting these sometimes very specific characteristics, sometimes a bit more um, broad and cohesive depending on the genus. Sometimes they bear a lot more in common visually. But this book is, books like it are going to help you understand how to, what we refer to as key out the visuals of specific identities of species of mushrooms. And you're doing the same with the landscape and the forests, coming to know the different habitats around the country or the state that you live in. Mountains versus chaparral versus oak woodlands versus pine forests versus meadows on the borders of forests along the coast, valleys, creek, riparian habitat. There's so many different types of, diverse ecology and tree diversity that, especially in mixed forest, you're going to probably find more variety of fungi growing in those places. So when I was talking about learning how to read the landscape, you're looking for a number of things. You're looking for trees, you're looking for creeks, you're looking for, okay, what direction or aspect does this hill or ridgeline face? A lot of the time, the understanding we have is a lot of these species of mushroom can be found in greater concentration on slopes or ridgelines or forests that face the north or the northwest. So that's a portion of it's like understanding which direction we're facing, especially with specific species that are like prized edibles. And also like understanding water table, because mushrooms love being tapped into moisture. So if there's a water table in an area, and by water table, I mean like the presence of water underground that we can't necessarily see. I mean, the portion of it we can see are creeks, rivers, ponds, springs, waterfalls. But the portion we can't see is what's underground. And that's obviously like where people are tapping wells into aquifers and whatnot. If there are underground springs running through areas, if there are creeks, seepage zones, which are known as these little pockets at the bottoms of hills and mountains near creeks where all the seasonal runoff sort of flows and congregates as it's, on its way to a pond or a lake or out to sea, the ocean, whatever. This is all water table, like when the rains come and replenish, they replenish the water table and the water table can rise. And then when we go through drought, it goes lower and lower and lower, or it just will evaporate from specific places. So understanding where your water table is, where your cool and moist, damp pockets are, places at the bottoms of canyons.
You mentioned prized edibles. You've said that a couple of times. What are those mushroom species that you're talking about that we consider kind of the best for eating?
Oh man, I mean, again, like I got buddies, mushroom hunters up in Mendo who love eating all of it. And, I'm one of those guys too. I say prize edibles because it's sort of just a way to describe mushrooms that are highly sought after by, you know, mushroom pickers, circuit pickers, commercial pickers, foragers, chefs, people who are picking for the restaurant scenes. But prize edibles, I would describe as obviously morels are a big usual suspect in that lineup because they're so delicious and they take time and they take skill. They take understanding habitat. They're definitely not a beginner's mushroom unless you're fortunate enough to live on the edge of mushroom country or you have family or friends that are experienced morel pickers. But morels is definitely one of them. Porcini, the king bolete, it gets a lot of attention and there's a huge like craze to go and hunt and find it. And there's a whole royal family around the king bolete. You got various species of kings and queens and cousins. And there's black trumpets. And black trumpets are sort of like an old, black, decrepit looking version of a mushroom that you'd look at in the wild and you wouldn't exactly think that it was good to eat. You'd think maybe more was like decomposing or rotting, but that's just sort of a deceptive facade. This mushroom looks like for lack of a better way to describe it, sort of a bouquet of black petunias. And it's faintly outlined around the ruffly edge by this sort of pale ash gray or beige outlining. And so that is something that sort of helps you to see it stand out. But a lot of the forest it grows in is, tan oak. So the beds of the tan oak leaves can be decomposing and rotting and quite wet from precipitation and rainfall. And so the black trumpets really just blend into this rotting, decaying understory of leaves. And so they can be quite difficult to find unless they are, say, standing out with a background or a bed of moss behind it.
Yeah, and those are my favorite mushrooms.
I love them.
Yeah, and do you find them around here a lot?
Absolutely not. We don't have black trumpet here that I'm aware of. They are a northern variety. I believe that the furthest south they have been found, and I could be wrong about this, is Santa Cruz. There may have been a sighting. I'm not always up to date on new discoveries, but there may have been a sighting somewhere around Monterey and the deep dank forest, but I can't remember for sure. Definitely Santa Cruz. As far as I'm aware, I get facts mixed up sometimes. But they do grow in Sonoma County, absolutely in Mendocino County, but
But
that's
not in
all.
Southern California.
Definitely not in SoCal.
That was my first experience with mushroom hunting. My wife and I got to go with some friends in France, and we gathered bags and bags of chanterelle and black trumpet. And it was just a magical day of eating. It was about 12 of us, and I'm not sure that we were being very ethical with our collection. And that's my next question for you. I will admit that maybe we were being a little bit overzealous with our picking, but
It
you and
happened.
I talked about this earlier in the week about a code of ethics for mushroom hunting. What would you consider the right way, the do's and don'ts of mushroom hunting?
Yeah, absolutely, man. I mean, it kind of, there's various portions, parts, and principles to that. And from really the first years that I got interested in this and started approaching people, I quickly found out that there are certain questions that are sort of frowned upon. by, experienced pickers and mushroom hunters, etc. Not to come off like with total mushroom picker snobbery here, but what I have experienced and observed is, mushroom hunting for a lot of experienced folks who are doing this, it's sort of a private and personal process and experience. I mean, there are those of us that really love sharing with groups and taking people out and being very generous and open. But the mushroom hunters and foragers that I have learned the most from and, have formed relationships with that I respect the most, there seems to be sort of this mutual feeling and understanding that we really just appreciate and value when beginners want to do the work and learn and buy the books and, hire professionals to take them out and teach them the things that they have learned for, 15, 20, 30 years or more. And some people even more if they've been doing this since they're little and they're in like their 60s, 70s, or 80s. But we really appreciate it when people sort of have the sense enough to know, hey, let me let me learn from you. Let me do my own legwork. Let me buy books. Let me go out and make my own discoveries. So that's the way that I teach people now. I won't take people to go and forage and pick prize edible mushrooms and patches. Instead, I see the value in training them to have a connection with the land, to respect and value it and honor it, and then teach them about how to go out and source their own habitats. Because if they get to learn this way, they can then take that anywhere and apply it and find their own places, therefore potentially being more valuable and more meaningful to them. And it's also highly likely that they may, through that process, learn to respect and value and treasure those spots and take care of them.
Is it considered impolite to ask a mushroom hunter where they pick?
Most mushroom pickers and, people that I come across online or in person are pretty good sports about it, and they'll just sort of shrug it off or laugh. And then they won't tell specifics, but people who are real open books and generous will be like, "Sure, this is where I picked them, and go ahead." The only issue with that is it's wonderful to be open and giving and sort of community vibe oriented with this stuff. But the thing is that there's a lot of buzz and a lot of attention with this stuff, and we can't always count on people's discernment or how they're going to treat places in nature, whether they're going to trash them or stomp all over them. I think soil compaction in the forest being one of the most, things that would negatively impact places where mushrooms grow. So less feet in the forest kind of mentality.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so we shouldn't ask, but if a experienced forager wants to share, that's something special, sounds like.
Absolutely. And I mean, of course, we have to ask questions that we shouldn't ask. That's how we learn how people feel about stuff. So I think giving people the opportunity in the room to make mistakes and learn and still be welcomed to learn more, even though they didn't ask the right questions or maybe impolite questions, it's just part of life. So I don't really feel like there really should be set rules, do's and don'ts when it comes to asking people about where they pick their mushrooms. So
So what's the next part of the code?
well, but there's a lot to the code, man.
Sustainable harvesting? Like how much should we take?
Sustainable harvesting, yeah, I mean, that really ties into reciprocity and there's different ways of looking at this, but with mushroom hunters and a lot of guys I know, especially dudes up north, and I was one of these dudes for a long time, there's this whole understanding, and it's sort of a widespread common knowledge that a lot of the prize edible mushrooms we like to pick have a mycorrhizal relationship with forests and trees. And that the whole mycelial network, the kingdom is underground. It gets restored with the proper weather, rainfall, precipitation annually, whatever. And as long as that is there and not lost through land development, there should be a continuous supply of flowers and fruits, being the mushrooms from the larger organism. So there's even theories that the more we pick, the more will grow, almost thinking of mycelium as like a giant underground fruit tree. We pick the tree to keep the tree healthy, and it continues to produce fruit. So if we know how to pick and harvest, then this plant, lack of a better word, plant underground will continue to produce. So yeah, I mean, and then there are those folks who really have this like deep belief that, well, why do we need to take more than we really need in life? Why don't we learn from the people that stewarded this land before we came here? They didn't take more than they needed. They honored and respected and loved nature, mushrooms, animals that they hunted, plants, herbs, medicines, whatever. They didn't take in excess. They took enough to feed themselves and their loved ones and their village. And now these days, our village is our community. So I would really pose that thought process to people. And I know that people are out there picking mushrooms for a living or, make extra money. And obviously we can't and won't tell them not to do it anymore. But I would challenge and like to pose the question as a challenge to really have people check in with their hearts. Like, do I really need to take all of this much?
And so is there a really easy way to kind of help people think about that concept? I mean, like don't take more than half or do we pick the first or the last mushroom? Like what are your thoughts there?
Sure. And again, this ties into a lot of indigenous and American Indian belief systems of reciprocity. And, there are other examples of this. I'm not just totally, this isn't esoteric. I'm not totally making this stuff up because it feels good, but it does feel good. But yeah, I would say there are a few ways to look at it. A good scientific mycologist buddy of mine, um, really like drew up this vision of how he described it. And he said, like, now mind you, this isn't terribly scientific, but there are suggested scientific theories to it. And it's like, well, mushrooms were evolved to spread spores and grow new mycelial networks under forests, under the woodlands, with trees and plants. So they're popping up as the reproductive portion of this larger organism to spread spores and grow new networks. But that mushroom's only there because it has a connection to the specific tree host, the forest, etc. And trees don't live forever. So what happens when the forest is gone or the tree's gone? If we've just gone and taken as much as we want all the time of this mushroom, how is that going to potentially impact that mushroom's ability to spread and grow new mycelial networks? Will our kids have them around? Will our kids' kids and their children's children? What sort of impact or example are we setting for our future? And what have we learned about that whole cycle of just take, take, take? Because it's all been done before. And now we're seeing how some of this stuff has potentially, adversely impacted the planet that we live on now. So reciprocity for me, when it comes to picking mushrooms, yeah, there's been sort of the Western or, yeah, I don't know if it's more spread out through Europe, because that's where mushroom hunting really came from, is the old country, Russia, possibly China, the places, some of the older places where people were gathering medicines, mushrooms, herbs, plants. Um, there are different thought process regarding this. Like we can just pick as much as we want, and the mycelium continues to produce and is plentiful. But yeah, if we're trying to observe more of a native people's practice with this stuff, I really believe like it comes back to reciprocity, and reciprocity has, set of guidelines. And, with indigenous people, with Native Americans, they didn't really pick the first or the last of whatever they found in the forest. That was sort of how they viewed their rights to pick and gather and hunt, is they wouldn't gather the first or the last. They wouldn't gather just one species if they only found one of that type of species. They were discerning and feeling their environments, feeling nature, feeling the forest. How abundant is this place? How does it feel? What does it look like? So They wouldn't pick the first or the last. It's my understanding. They also wouldn't pick the only, one of those things that they found. And they believed in gathering what they felt like nature was offering. And so how that can be sort of thought about is, well, hunters out there with a bow or a gun, they were waiting for a deer, they would take one arrow or one bullet and they would wait. And when a deer, came by but didn't really present a clear shot, they didn't really see that or view that as nature offering. And this is how I've heard it described in, old storytelling is, the deer would come into the clearing and stand right before the hunter. And they knew that was their representation of nature offering. They had their one arrow, they had their one bullet.
Wow.
So how that could be looked at in mushroom hunting, I would feel would be, mushrooms are hiders. They are really great at camouflaging and hiding and sort of being in betwixt and in between things. And when mushrooms are still young, before they've had the chance to fully mature and release spores, which is what they were put on this earth to do and be food and medicine for us, but first and foremost to release spores. Before they are mature enough, they're hiding most of the time. They're hiding under leaves, they're hiding under pine needles, moss. They haven't fully matured. So the idea of tying all of this back in with reciprocity and ethics and sustainability, for me, it feels like we shouldn't harvest mushrooms until they've had a chance to release spores and propagate is the word. So when a mushroom is fully popped out of the leaves or the pine needles or the moss, or we can check to see when there's spore dust around it, spore deposit. For me, that is a clear indication from nature. This specimen has already done what it was put here to do. Now we can gather it and harvest it and know that we're not taking away from the process of propagation.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense.
So that is how I look at that. Yeah.
What about leave no trace? That seems pretty
Leave,
straightforward.
absolutely. Leave no trace for me. I mean, and it's a great philosophy in itself. So if I was going to go into the forest and use the philosophy, leave no trace, I'm going to think of it as you pack it in and you pack it out. If you bring things that didn't belong in the forest in the first place, your trash, your soda cans, your bottles, your water bottles, your wrappers, whatever, just, it's simple. Take it with you. Why you got to leave it in the forest? It's not going to decompose there. It's not biodegradable. So we should take our trash with us. And we should also think about that whole reciprocity thing of giving back to the environment, which we are going and we're happy to receive and gather and take from. That's a way we can give back is by clearing out trash and litter and debris and things. And a lot of forests are totally trash these days. So yeah, for me, it's like take your trash with you, leave with more trash than you came with, leave your environment looking better than you found it. It also comes down to harvesting mushrooms and like being conscientious of how we walk in the forest. And I've heard mushroom pickers and experts talk about only walking on deer paths when they're going through the forest, because those are the paths that are already made in the forest. And how I understand this being something that, could potentially be impactful is that one of the greatest losses of habitat, mushroom habitat, is soil compaction. When you have a lot of feet moving through the forest, when you have like you're bringing groups, you have heavy equipment, whatever, that really condenses soil and makes the spreading of mycelium a little bit more non-existent. That's why we see a lot of the time we see mushrooms pop up on both sides of a path or along edges of a path. And there's different theories to that, but one of them that's more scientific is mycelium can't spread underneath that compacted soil on the path. So it sends up a little beacon on the one edge of the path, one side of the path, which releases spores to drift in the wind to the other side. So that's a lot of the time why we see mushrooms bordering paths and forests. So that's a big part of it. Another part of it is I know this great guy named Billy Sprague. Actually, he puts together these little knives, sort of devise these knives by repurposing an old linoleum floor knife and then adding this really awesome horsehair brush on the end. So this is a great tool to use in the forest because it's sort of like a multiple tool in one accessory to have. And, we can gather our mushrooms by, gently uncovering them and, cutting the root ball off of the mushroom. The root ball is the very bottom portion, like base of the stem of the mushroom that still has dirt clumped onto it. We're not going to take that. I mean, we don't need to take it home and throw it out. We should leave as many of the remnants of the mushroom in the forest as we can when we pick our mushrooms. So if we get into the habit of field dressing our mushrooms, and this tool will help us do exactly that, then this is also a sustainable practice with thought and respect and honoring of nature. So we pick our mushroom out of the ground, we cut the root ball off, we plant it back in the ground. It's not going to keep growing, but it leaves remnants of that spore dust and whatnot, remnants of that organism behind in its natural environment where it should stay. And then we take our brush and we brush the cap and the stem and we tap the top of the mushroom, potentially leaving spores behind. And then we smooth our pine needles or our leaves over, almost as if we've never been there, leaving no trace. And this is a really helpful and tactile and tactful approach to picking mushrooms because it almost leaves it looking like nobody was even there if you got finesse. And also it's respectful to the environment.
Love it. What about raking?
My opinion on raking is that it's it feels disrespectful, man. I have grown up in a portion of mountain range that's perpetually dry. And it's only ever damp here in the winter when we get our annual winter rains, if we get them at all. So there are species of mushroom here that have evolved and learn how to adapt to a more arid environment. And though I say arid, we're right next to the ocean. But it's pretty Mediterranean and deserty around here. So a lot of these prize edible mushrooms, specifically golden, California golden chanterelle, I've observed them over a lifetime growing in these very specific pocket-like environments where the oak leaf litter is, possibly 5, 7, 10 years worth of or more of decomposing oak leaves. And it provides this safety security blanket of humidity. And this is where these mushrooms really love to grow. It nurtures them. And they do most of their growing underneath the oak leaves until they're mature enough to pop up and reveal themselves. So when people are coming in, circuit pickers, commercial pickers that are doing it for profit, or maybe they're just not initiated and they're excited, whatever it is. And if people come into these environments and they move all the oak leaves and pile them into, big piles everywhere, sort of like raking, whether they're doing it with an actual rake or just with their hands or whatever, then what I have observed in watching this process is that a lot of these places that gave hundreds of mushrooms or even hundreds of pounds of mushrooms, the mushrooms don't come back.
Well, that makes total sense if you're removing the material that feeds the mushrooms.
You're disturbing the natural process. So,
Yeah, exactly.
and I've observed it. I've observed it over years, places where hundreds of pounds of mushrooms grow and they've been raked and big piles of leaves pushed everywhere. And then the leaves aren't getting put back. The mushrooms aren't coming back.
How about legal and safety concerns?
Wow. Oh my God, legal and safety concerns. Yeah, man. I think that, gosh, I've been a young rascal growing up here in Topanga, and I have certainly picked mushrooms in places that I probably not supposed to. Maybe didn't know that it was private land, or I surely know that state parks they don't want the removal of living or non-living organic matter from their property.
Okay, so California state parks, no go.
They don't want people picking mushrooms. And we can lead groups and show people for education, but we can't pick them. So, yeah, I mean, I have mixed feelings about that, but I'm not looking to, have the angry villagers and pitchforked after me anymore. So I think that it's important for people to understand where it's permitted to pick mushrooms for obvious reasons.
What about safety concerns?
I mean, safety concerns, I mean, it's really about just being super careful and respectful when you're learning about edible species. Just because somebody tells us something is edible, when we pick things in the wild, then the responsibility is on us to really be 100% confirmed as to what it is we're choosing to pick and consume.
So just because the app on my phone says this is okay to eat, I shouldn't accept that as gospel.
I think that using apps on phones to distinguish what is safe and edible is a major error and fallacy at this point in time. And there are people in our country and other countries that have used apps and have poisoned themselves. So I think apps are a great extension to a learning process, but I really can't stress enough about how important having reputable field guides to track and learn how to identify the characteristics and diagnostics of a mushroom really play into all of this. And hiring experts, joining mycological societies, really doing the work, the due diligence before we decide we're going to say that something is safe for the table. So,
And that's a great plug for the LA Mycological Society. Every month during mushroom hunting season, they have an identification hour, I think just before the meeting, right? So you
yeah,
can bring stuff in that you've found and maybe try to positively identify, but get a third party to confirm if you're new to the art.
I think having the input and the advice and the perspective of experts who have been doing this a long time, it's totally invaluable. And again, I encourage people to do their own work and look for their own answers, do their own research, be their own scientist, be involved in this process, because that is what is going to build our relationship and offer us a chance to have a true connection, an authentic connection to this work. So just because somebody tells you something doesn't mean you should just take that and regurgitate it or run with it. I think that there's this beautiful opportunity for us to connect with our earth, our planet, our environment, and learn about what's healthy and good for us to put in our bodies.
I love this. Thank you so much again, Brando, for talking to us today. I'm going to put all the books that Brando mentioned in the Substack newsletter that comes out with this podcast. I'll have a couple of other good links, one to lambs as well, and when the next meeting is. But you've been a wealth of knowledge. I hope a lot of people learn more about how to be good stewards of the mushroom world by following your code of ethics and going out there and giving it a shot, which I think is really what you're saying is let's go out and with a little education and with a little bit of patience, go out and learn about the bounty of this beautiful earth that we've been given. So thanks.
Absolutely, man. There's so much more magic and depth and meaning to kingdom fungi rather than just what can I eat. So, yeah, I encourage people to just go into it open and be prepared because you're probably going to leave with a lot more than you figured you would. Yes.
Remind us where we can find all of this information.
Oh, you can find me, Brando Farr, on Instagram under Far and Wild, and that's Far with two R's, AND, and then Wild like the wild.
Brando, I just really want to thank you for sharing your vision for a future of not only mushroom hunting, but just a better connection to our food, connection to nature, and an appreciation for how we're all in this big giant ecosystem spinning around a sun together. And maybe we can learn a little bit more from each other and from the mushrooms, I think it sounds like. So
The mushrooms are, yeah, man, they got a lot to offer us. They're wonderful givers and teachers. So
well, and so are you. I appreciate your time and your perspective and your tips. And definitely check Brando out on his Instagram page. Thanks again, everybody, for listening. If you've got questions on mushrooms and you want to send them to Enlightened Omnivore, feel free to send them through the Substack app, or you can send them to my email at steve@enlightenedomnivore.com. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time. And that wraps up another episode of Enlightened Omnivore. A special thanks to all my subscribers for listening in this week. You can all read more about everything omnivorous on my weekly Substack newsletter found at enlightenedomnivore.substack.com.